The rain pounded mercilessly against the ferry's wooden deck, as Penelope Gilbert clutched the railing with white knuckles, her heart pounding harder than the storm that threatened to swallow the Missouri River whole. It was 1878, and what should have been a routine crossing from Belmont, Nevada to the promising new settlement across the water had turned into a nightmare as the small ferry lurched dangerously in the churning waters. "Hold fast," the captain shouted over the howling wind, but his voice was immediately drowned by the sickening crack of wood splitting beneath them. Penelope's scream joined the chorus of terror as the deck beneath her feet suddenly tilted. The trunk containing everything she owned, letters from her late parents, the deed to a small plot of land she'd never seen, and the last of her savings slid across the deck and disappeared into the roiling waters. She had no time to mourn its loss as passengers scrambled in panic, some jumping overboard despite the treacherous current. "We're going down," someone cried, and Penelope knew with terrible certainty it was true. The ferry gave another violent lurch, throwing her against the railing. Cold water surged over the deck, soaking her heavy skirts and pulling at her like hungry hands. Penelope had never learned to swim growing up in Boston, had provided few opportunities for such skills, and now that lack might cost her life. When the ferry finally broke apart, there was no time to think. Freezing water engulfed her, dragging her down as her sodden clothes became anchors. She fought desperately, clawing toward what she hoped was the surface, lungs burning with the need for air. Just as spots danced before her eyes, her head broke the surface and she gasped painfully, choking on water and air alike. "Help!" she cried, her voice thin against the storm's rage. The shore seemed impossibly distant, a dark smudge barely visible through the sheets of rain. Debris from the ferry floated around her, but nothing substantial enough to keep her afloat. Already her strength was flagging, her limbs growing numb in the frigid water. From the shoreline, a figure appeared, running toward the water's edge. Even through her terror, Penelope registered the silhouette of a man tall and broad-shouldered, moving with purposeful strides. He paused only to shed his coat and hat before plunging into the churning river. Miles Caldwell had been herding his cattle to higher ground when he'd spotted the ferry in distress. He'd raced to the river's edge, heart pounding with dread as he watched the small craft finally succumb to the storm's fury. When he heard the woman's cry, something inside him responded with fierce urgency. He didn't think, he simply acted. The current fought him as he swam toward the struggling figure, but years of ranch work had built strength in his arms and shoulders. Each powerful stroke brought him closer to the woman, whose movements were growing increasingly feeble. "Hold on," he shouted, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him over the storm. He reached her just as she began to slip beneath the surface again, his strong arms circling her waist and pulling her up against him. "I've got you," he said, his mouth close to her ear. "Just hold on to me. Don't fight." Penelope barely had the strength to nod, her fingers clutching desperately at his soaked shirt. Her rescuer turned onto his back, keeping her head above water as he began the arduous journey back to shore, fighting the current that sought to drag them both downstream. Miles could feel the woman trembling violently against him, her breathing ragged. The shore seemed to recede with each stroke, but he refused to surrender to the river's fury. With grim determination, he continued swimming, one arm securely around the woman, the other cutting through the water. When his boots finally touched the riverbed, he nearly wept with relief. Standing in the waist-deep water, he gathered the half-conscious woman into his arms and staggered toward the shore, his legs leaden with exhaustion. He collapsed onto the muddy bank, still cradling her against his chest. "Miss, can you hear me?" Miles gently brushed soaked tendrils of hair from her face. She was pale, far too pale, her lips tinged with blue. Penelope forced her eyes open, vision blurry as she gazed up at her rescuer. His features were indistinct in the dim light, but she could see concern etched in the strong lines of his face. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. "We need to get you somewhere warm," Miles said, looking around frantically. His ranch was too far, especially in this storm, but he knew of an old line shack nearby, used by cowboys during roundup season. "Can you stand?" she tried, but her legs crumpled beneath her. Without hesitation, Miles swept her back into his arms. "My name's Miles Caldwell," he said, hoping conversation might keep her alert. "I've got a shelter not far from here. Hold on." "Penelope Gilbert," she managed through chattering teeth, pressing herself against his warmth. The trek to the line shack was grueling. The rain continued to pour, turning the ground to treacherous mud that sucked at Miles's boots with each step. Penelope drifted in and out of awareness, occasionally mumbling about her lost trunk and something about Boston. Finally, the small wooden structure came into view, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky. Miles kicked the door open, grateful to find it unlocked as most line shacks were. The interior was spare but dry: a small table and chair, a narrow cot, and most importantly, a small iron stove in the corner with a stack of firewood beside it. He gently laid Penelope on the cot, concern mounting as he noted her shallow breathing. "Miss Gilbert, you need to get out of those wet clothes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and professional. "You'll catch your death otherwise." Penelope's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on him. "I have nothing else to wear," she whispered. Miles turned to a small trunk in the corner, hoping it contained the standard supplies kept in line shacks. To his relief, he found a wool blanket and a spare flannel shirt, likely left by the last cowhand who'd used the shelter. "I'll build a fire and turn my back," he said. "Please, change into this. It's not much, but it's dry." While Penelope weakly struggled with the sodden fastenings of her dress, Miles busied himself with the stove, his cold, numbed fingers fumbling with kindling and matches. When the fire finally caught, spreading blessed warmth through the small space, he removed his own wet shirt and hung it near the stove, keeping his back resolutely turned to give her privacy. "I'm decent," Penelope finally said, her voice stronger than before. Miles turned to find her wrapped in the blanket, her wet clothes spread before the stove. The large flannel shirt hung to her knees, and despite the dire circumstances, he couldn't help noticing how the firelight caught the copper highlights in her damp hair. "Are there others?" she asked suddenly, eyes widening with remembered horror. "From the ferry," Miles's expression grew grim. "I don't know, I only saw you. The current was strong," he broke off, unwilling to voice what they both knew. The chances of other survivors were slim. Tears welled in Penelope's eyes. "There were at least 10 people aboard, families with children." A sob escaped her, quickly stifled by her hand. Unsure how to comfort her, Miles busied himself heating water in a small pot he'd found, making tea from the supplies in the trunk. "Here," he said, offering her a steaming cup. "It'll help warm you from inside." Penelope accepted it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the cup. "I've lost everything," she said quietly after taking a sip. "My papers, my money, my clothes, all gone." "You're alive," Miles pointed out gently. "That's what matters right now." She looked up at him, really seeing him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with sun-browned skin that spoke of years outdoors. His dark hair curled slightly where it was beginning to dry, and his eyes, a striking shade of blue, regarded her with genuine concern. "Yes," she agreed softly. "Thanks to you." Miles shrugged off her gratitude, suddenly self-conscious. Anyone would have done the same. No, Penelope said with surprising firmness. Not everyone would have risked their life in those waters. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Miles cleared his throat. "If you don't mind my asking, Miss Gilbert, what brings you to these parts? You don't sound like you're from around here." "I'm from Boston," she confirmed. "I came west because—" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "My parents died last year of influenza. With them gone, there was nothing keeping me in Boston. I answered an advertisement for a teaching position in New Summit." Miles nodded. New Summit was the settlement across the river, newly established and growing rapidly with the recent discovery of silver in the nearby mountains. "They're in need of a teacher there," he agreed. "Lot of families moving in with the mining prospects. And now I've lost my letter of appointment, along with everything else." Penelope's voice trembled slightly. "I don't even know if they'll still accept me without it." "People out here care more about what you can do than what papers you carry," Miles assured her. "If you can teach, they'll welcome you." Penelope wasn't convinced but nodded anyway. The warmth of the fire and tea were making her drowsy, her body finally reacting to the trauma and exhaustion. Miles noticed her struggling to keep her eyes open. "You should rest," he said, rising to his feet. "I'll keep watch and make sure the fire stays lit." "Where will you sleep?" she asked, already half dreaming. "I'll be fine in the chair," he said. "I've slept in worse places on cattle drives." Penelope wanted to protest, to insist he take the cot, but exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words. Her last conscious thought was gratitude that of all the people who might have been on that riverbank, it had been this kind, strong man who'd seen her struggling in the water. Miles watched her drift into sleep, her features softening as tension left her body. He added more wood to the stove, settled into the uncomfortable chair, and prepared for a long night. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the small shelter, there was warmth, safety, and the quiet breathing of the woman he'd pulled from the river's deadly embrace. Morning arrived with tentative sunlight streaming through the lined shack's single window. Penelope woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day came rushing back: the ferry, the storm, the struggle in the water, and the cowboy who'd risked his life to save hers. She sat up, wincing at the soreness in her muscles, and looked around the small room. Miles was asleep in the chair, his head at an awkward angle that would surely leave him with a stiff neck. In the gentle morning light, she could see him more clearly, the strong line of his jaw shadowed with stubble, the calluses on his hands speaking of hard work, the peaceful expression that softened his features in sleep. As if sensing her gaze, Miles stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment he seemed as disoriented as she had been, but recognition quickly dawned. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Penelope admitted, "but alive thanks to you." Miles stood and stretched, grimacing as his joints protested. "Your clothes should be dry by now," he said, gesturing to where her dress hung near the stove. "I'll step outside while you dress." After he'd gone, Penelope rose shakily from the cot. Her dress was indeed dry, though wrinkled and still bearing the river's gritty residue. As she dressed, the magnitude of her situation settled heavily upon her shoulders. She was in a strange land, with no possessions, no money, and no proof of her teaching appointment. The future that had seemed so carefully planned now lay in ruins, as thoroughly destroyed as the ferry that had sunk beneath the churning waters. When Miles returned, he carried a canteen of fresh water and a handful of berries. "It's not much of a breakfast," he apologized, "but it'll keep us going until we reach my ranch." "Your ranch?" Penelope asked, Accepting the modest offerings gratefully, Miles nodded. "It's about 4 miles east of here. We can rest there, and then I can take you to New Summit to see about your teaching position." He hesitated, then added, "Unless you'd prefer to go back to Belmont. There might be officials there who could help you with your lost documents." Penelope considered her options. Belmont had nothing for her. She'd merely passed through on her way to the ferry crossing. "No," she decided. "I came west to teach. I intend to fulfill that purpose if they'll still have me." A smile of approval flickered across Miles's face. "That's the spirit. Out here, folks respect someone who doesn't fold at the first sign of trouble." They set out after their meager breakfast, Miles leading the way across terrain that would have been challenging even without Penelope's still weakened condition and impractical footwear. He offered his arm for difficult sections, and Penelope accepted without pride. She'd learned the hard value of practical help over genteel independence during the river's fury. "Have you lived here long?" she asked as they navigated a particularly rocky stretch. "Born and raised in Nevada territory," Miles replied. "My father started the ranch with nothing but a few cattle and sheer stubbornness, built it up over 20 years. A shadow crossed his face. "He passed 3 years ago. My mother followed 6 months later." "I'm sorry," Penelope said softly, recognizing the familiar ache of loss in his voice. "It's not easy, is it, being the one left behind?" Miles glanced at her, surprised by her understanding. "No, it isn't. Though I suspect losing both parents at once, as you did, has its own kind of pain." "Different paths, same destination," she murmured. "Grief doesn't particularly care how it arrives." They walked in companionable silence for a while, each lost in memories of those they'd lost. The landscape around them was beautiful in its rugged way. Sagebrush dotted the rolling hills, and in the distance, mountains rose in purple majesty against the clear sky. Despite her circumstances, Penelope found herself appreciating the wild openness of the West, so different from Boston's crowded streets. "There it is," Miles said finally, pointing to a collection of buildings nestled in a small valley ahead. "Caldwell Ranch. Not the biggest spread in Nevada, but it's mine." As they drew closer, Penelope could see a modest but well-maintained main house, a large barn, several corrals, and a bunkhouse. 2 cowboys were working with horses in one of the corrals, and smoke rose from the chimney of what she assumed was a cookhouse. "Miles!" A tall, lanky cowboy spotted them and raised his hand in greeting, then froze when he noticed Penelope. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, loud enough for them to hear. "Boss brought home a lady." Miles shot the man a warning look. "Mind your mouth, Hank. Miss Gilbert here was on the ferry that went down in yesterday's storm. I'm giving her shelter until she can get to New Summit." Hank had the grace to look abashed. "Beg your pardon, madam. We heard about the ferry this morning. Trail boss from the Double R came by, said they found some wreckage," and he stopped, glancing uncomfortably at Penelope. "Any survivors?" Miles asked quietly. Hank shook his head. "Just bodies, boss. 3 so far. They're still searching." Penelope swayed slightly, and Miles's arm was instantly around her waist, steadying her. "Let's get you inside," he said gently. "Hank, ask Mrs. Perez to prepare a bath and some food for our guest. And see if she has any clothes that might fit Miss Gilbert." The ranch house was simple but comfortable, with solid furniture and a few touches curtains at the windows, a braided rug on the floor that spoke of a woman's influence from years past. Miles led Penelope to a chair near the fireplace. "Mrs. Perez is our cook and housekeeper," he explained. "Been with the family since I was a boy. She'll help you get settled." As if on cue, a plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor bustled into the room. She took one look at Penelope and clicked her tongue in sympathy. "Dios mío, you poor thing," she said, her accent revealing her Mexican heritage. "Come with me. A hot bath is what you need, and then food." Penelope allowed herself to be led to a small room at the back of the house where a copper tub was being filled with steaming water. Mrs. Perez efficiently added scented oil, then set out a simple dress, undergarments, and a comb. "These were Miles's mother's," she explained. "She was taller than you, but we can fix that with pins. Now I'll leave you to your bath. Call if you need anything." Left alone, Penelope sank gratefully into the hot water, tears suddenly streaming down her face as the events of the past 24 hours finally overwhelmed her. She'd nearly died. She was probably the only survivor of the ferry disaster. Everything she owned was gone. And yet, by some miracle, she'd been seen by a cowboy who'd risked his life to save a stranger. By the time she emerged from the bath, dressed in the borrowed clothes that had been hastily altered to fit her smaller frame, Penelope felt marginally better. Her hair, brushed and beginning to dry in loose waves, hung down her back instead of in its usual neat arrangement, but she had no pins to secure it. Mrs. Perez led her to the kitchen, where a bowl of fragrant stew and a thick slice of bread awaited her. "Eat," the older woman insisted. "You need your strength." Penelope didn't need to be told twice. She was ravenous, the simple berries from breakfast long since burned away by their trek across the countryside. "Miles tells me you're a teacher," Mrs. Perez said as she bustled around the kitchen. Penelope nodded, swallowing a mouthful of stew. "Yes, though I'm not sure what I'll do now without my letter of appointment, or any other identification for that matter." Mrs. Perez waved a hand dismissively. "New Summit needs a teacher badly. Those miners' children are running wild." "They'll take you." "I hope you're right," Penelope said. "I don't have the means to return east even if I wanted to." The older woman studied her with shrewd eyes. "You're stronger than you look," she declared. "You'll do well out here." "Thank you," Penelope said, touched by the vote of confidence from this woman who barely knew her. Miles joined them as Penelope was finishing her meal. He'd changed into clean clothes and looked refreshed, though she noticed the shadows under his eyes that spoke of his sleepless night in the lined shack's chair. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Much," Penelope confirmed. "Your Mrs. Perez has been very kind." The housekeeper snorted. "It's the least we can do for someone who's been through such an ordeal." She turned to Miles. "I've made up the guest room for Miss Gilbert." "Thank you, Mrs. Perez." Miles turned back to Penelope. "I've sent Hank to New Summit with news of your survival. He'll speak to the town council about your teaching position. He should be back by tomorrow." Gratitude washed over Penelope. This man continued to help her without hesitation, asking nothing in return. "You're very kind, Mr. Caldwell." "Miles, please," he said. "And it's nothing you wouldn't do for someone in need." That evening, after a simple but satisfying supper, Penelope and Miles sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink. The air was cool but not cold, and Mrs. Perez had provided a shawl for Penelope's shoulders. "It's beautiful," Penelope said softly, gazing at the vast expanse of sky. "In Boston, the buildings block most of the horizon. I've never seen a sunset like this." "One of the reasons I could never leave this place," Miles admitted. "There's something about this land that gets into your blood." "I can see why," Penelope said. "There's a freedom here, a sense of possibility." Miles studied her profile in the fading light. "Most Eastern women I've met can't wait to get back to civilization. They find it too harsh out here." Penelope turned to meet his gaze. "Perhaps I'm not like most Eastern women." Something flickered in Miles's eyes, interest, perhaps, or simple approval. "No," he agreed quietly. I don't believe you are. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, brilliant pinpoints in the darkening sky. Eventually, the cooling air drove them inside, and Miles showed Penelope to the guest room. "Sleep well," he said, lingering in the doorway. "You're safe here." "Thank you," Penelope said, meaning it for far more than just the room. For everything. After he'd gone, she sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the simple quilt. In just 2 days, her life had been completely upended, nearly ended, in fact. Yet somehow, she didn't feel the panic or despair she might have expected. Instead, there was a strange sense of possibility, as vast and open as the Nevada sky. Penelope slept deeply that night, without dreams of churning water or desperate cries. When morning came, she felt truly rested for the first time since leaving Boston. She found Miles in the kitchen, discussing the day's ranch work with 2 cowboys. He broke off when she entered, rising to his feet with a smile that made something flutter in her chest. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Perez handed her. "Hank should be back from New Summit by midday," Miles told her. "Until then, would you like a tour of the ranch?" Penelope eagerly accepted, and after breakfast, Miles showed her around his property. The ranch was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with grazing land stretching for miles. He explained the cattle operation, pointing out the different breeds, and discussing the challenges of ranching in Nevada's sometimes harsh climate. "Water is everything out here," he said as they paused beside a small creek that ran through the property. "My father chose this land because of this creek. It never runs dry, even in the worst drought years." "He was a wise man," Penelope observed. Miles nodded, a wistful expression crossing his face. "He was. Taught me everything I know about ranching, about being a man of my word." He glanced at her. "He would have liked you." "Why do you say that?" Penelope asked, curious. "You've got grit," Miles replied simply. "Pa always said that was the quality that mattered most out here, more than breeding or book learning." "I'm not sure I've demonstrated much grit," Penelope said with a self-deprecating laugh. "All I did was nearly drown." "You survived," Miles countered. "And instead of falling apart afterward, you're already planning how to move forward. That's grit." Penelope hadn't thought of it that way, but his words warmed her. They continued their tour, Miles introducing her to the various ranch hands they encountered. All were respectful, tipping their hats and greeting her politely, though she caught curious glances exchanged behind their backs. "They're wondering who I am," she observed as they walked away from 2 cowboys who'd been mending a corral fence. Miles looked embarrassed. "I don't often have female visitors," he admitted, "especially not one staying at the house." "I'm causing gossip," Penelope realized with dismay. "Nothing like that," Miles assured her quickly. "They know the circumstances. It's just," he hesitated, then continued, "it's been a long time since there was a woman's presence in the main house, other than Mrs. Perez. My mother's been gone 3 years now." Penelope understood then. "And you haven't married?" Miles shook his head. "Running the ranch doesn't leave much time for courting, and there aren't many eligible women in these parts who'd be willing to take on a rancher's wife's life." A rueful smile touched his lips. "It's not exactly the refined existence many ladies expect." Before Penelope could respond, a rider approached, and she recognized Hank, returning from New Summit. The lanky cowboy dismounted, nodding to Penelope before turning to Miles. "Got word from the town council," he reported. "They're mighty relieved to hear Miss Gilbert survived. Said to tell her the teaching position is still hers if she wants it. School's set to start in 2 weeks." Relief washed over Penelope. "Thank goodness," she breathed. "There's more," Hank continued. The river's still running too high for the ferry crossing to be repaired right away. Might be a week or more before it's passable, and the only alternative route to New Summit would add 3 days to the journey. Miles frowned, considering this news. Miss Gilbert is welcome to stay here until the crossing is repaired, he said, glancing at her for confirmation. That's very generous, Penelope said, but I've imposed on your hospitality enough already. It's no imposition, Miles insisted, and it makes the most sense. Unless you'd prefer to stay in Belmont. Penelope thought of the rough mining town she'd passed through briefly. She knew no one there, had no money for lodging, and the idea of staying alone in a town full of miners and gamblers was far from appealing. If you're certain it's no trouble, she said finally, I would be grateful to stay. Something like pleasure flickered in Miles's eyes. It's settled then. That afternoon, they received more visitors, the sheriff from Belmont and a representative from the ferry company, come to take Penelope's statement about the disaster. The news was grim. Of the 12 passengers and 3 crew members aboard the ferry, only Penelope had survived. You were mighty fortunate Mr. Caldwell was nearby, madam, the sheriff said, his weathered face solemn. Most folks caught in that current wouldn't have stood a chance. I know, Penelope said quietly, her hand unconsciously seeking Miles's for comfort. He allowed the contact, his larger hand closing around hers. The ferry representative, a thin man with nervous mannerisms, assured Penelope that the company would compensate her for her lost possessions. It won't bring back the personal items, of course, he said apologetically, but it should help you start over. After they'd gone, Penelope found herself sitting with Miles on the porch again, watching the sunset. 12 families now grieving, she said softly. I keep wondering why I was the one who survived. Don't question it, Miles advised. Just be grateful and live a life worthy of the chance you've been given. Penelope nodded, drawing the borrowed shawl closer around her shoulders. That's wise counsel, she said. My father used to say something similar, that we don't choose what happens to us, only how we respond to it. Smart man, Miles observed. He was, Penelope agreed, her voice softening with memory. He was a professor of literature. Always had his nose in a book, but he understood people better than anyone I've ever known. And your mother? Miles asked. A musician. She taught piano to the daughters of Boston's elite. Penelope smiled at the recollection. She tried to teach me, but I have a terrible ear. I was much better with books, like my father. Is that why you became a teacher? Penelope nodded. That, and I love children. Their curiosity, their honesty. She glanced at him. What about your parents? You said your father built this ranch, but you haven't spoken much of your mother. A fond expression crossed Miles's face. She was from back east originally, Philadelphia. Came west as a young woman to teach, actually, much like you. Met my father when her stagecoach was attacked by outlaws. He happened to be riding nearby and drove them off. How romantic, Penelope said, genuinely charmed by the story. They were devoted to each other, Miles confirmed. When he died, it was like the light went out of her. She tried to carry on, but he shrugged, the gesture conveying volumes. She died of a broken heart, Penelope said softly. Miles nodded. That's what Mrs. Perez says. Doctors called it pneumonia, but we all knew the truth. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in thoughts of the past. Eventually, Miles spoke again. What will you do in New Summit? Besides teach, I mean. Penelope considered the question. Find lodging, I suppose. Learn about my new community, make a life for myself. Alone. The word hung between them, layered with meaning. For now, Penelope said carefully. Though I've never been opposed to marriage if the right situation presented itself. Miles nodded, his expression thoughtful. New Summit's growing fast, lot of opportunity there. And you, Penelope asked. "Will you always stay here on your ranch? It's in my blood," Miles said simply. "This land, these animals, they're my responsibility, my legacy." As the days passed, Penelope found herself falling into the rhythm of ranch life. Mrs. Perez showed her how to make tortillas and taught her Spanish phrases that made the older woman laugh when Penelope attempted to pronounce them. She helped gather eggs from the chicken coop and learned to milk the ranch's small herd of dairy cows. In the evenings, she and Miles would sit on the porch or by the fire, talking for hours about everything and nothing: books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd harbored as children. Penelope found herself looking forward to these conversations, to the way Miles listened so intently to her thoughts, as if they were valuable treasures. She also noticed the way his gaze followed her when she moved about the house, the way his hand sometimes lingered when he helped her into the saddle for their daily rides around the property. She wasn't immune to him either. The sight of him returning from work, shirt sleeves rolled up and hat tipped back, made her heart beat faster in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. A week after the ferry disaster, Miles received word that repairs to the crossing would be completed in 2 days. The news should have brought Penelope relief, but instead, she felt a strange reluctance at the thought of leaving the ranch and Miles. That evening they rode to a high point on the ranch property, a mesa overlooking the valley. The sunset was particularly spectacular, the sky ablaze with color. "I wanted you to see this before you leave," Miles said as they dismounted. "It's my favorite spot on the whole ranch." Penelope understood why as she took in the breathtaking vista. "It's magnificent," she said softly. Miles stood close beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "Penelope," he said, using her given name for the first time. "These past days," he broke off, seemingly struggling for words, which surprised her. Miles was typically direct, a man who said what he meant without embellishment. "Yes," she prompted gently. "I know we've not known each other long," he continued, turning to face her fully. "But sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of time. Sometimes it throws people together in the most unexpected ways." Penelope's heart began to race, hope and fear mingling in her chest. "Like a ferry sinking in a storm," she said softly. "Like that," Miles agreed, his blue eyes intent on hers. "I've come to care for you, Penelope, more than I thought possible in such a short time." "Miles," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, please. I know you came west to be a teacher. I know you've lost everything and are just beginning to find your feet again. I don't want to complicate that for you." He took a deep breath. "But I also don't want to let you go without telling you how I feel, without asking if there might be a chance for us." Penelope felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I've come to care for you too," she admitted. "More than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances." Hope blazed in Miles's eyes. "Does that mean? It means I don't know what the future holds," Penelope said honestly. "I still need to fulfill my commitment to teach in New Summit. I need to stand on my own feet after everything that's happened." Miles nodded, disappointment evident in his expression, though he tried to hide it. "But," Penelope continued, stepping closer to him, "New Summit isn't so very far from your ranch, and I'm told the road between them is quite passable in good weather." A slow smile spread across Miles's face as he understood her meaning. "Quite passable," he agreed. "A man might make the journey regularly if he had sufficient reason." "And would you?" Penelope asked, suddenly bold. "Have sufficient reason?" In answer, Miles closed the distance between them, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with exquisite gentleness. "More reason than I've ever had for anything in my life," he said softly, before lowering his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, questioning at first, but when Penelope responded, sliding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more powerful. When they finally parted, both were breathless, and Penelope felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world. "I should probably tell you," Miles said, his arms still around her waist, "that I'm not a man who gives his heart easily. But once given, it's given for good." "That's a quality we share," Penelope told him, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I don't take such matters lightly either." Miles pressed his forehead to hers. "So we'll see where this leads. You'll let me court you properly while you teach in New Summit." "Yes," Penelope agreed, happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. "Though our courtship has certainly had an unusual beginning." Miles laughed, the sound rich and warm in the gathering twilight. "I'd expect nothing less from a woman who introduced herself by nearly drowning in a river." Penelope swatted his arm playfully, but her laughter joined his, floating out over the valley as the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the Nevada sky. 2 days later, Miles drove Penelope to New Summit in his wagon, their journey made possible by the newly repaired river crossing. Their parting at the town's small schoolhouse was bittersweet, tempered by the knowledge that Miles would return in just 3 days' time. "The children will love you," he said, helping her down from the wagon. "Almost as much as I'm coming to." Penelope blushed at the declaration, still unused to the directness of his affection. "3 days," she reminded him, squeezing his hand. "I'll count the hours," Miles promised. True to his word, Miles returned to New Summit regularly over the following weeks, his visits becoming a fixture of Penelope's new life. She threw herself into teaching with characteristic dedication, quickly winning the respect of her students and their parents. The town council, grateful to have a properly educated teacher, provided her with a small but comfortable cottage near the schoolhouse. For his part, Miles found reasons to be in New Summit with increasing frequency, supplies to purchase, business to conduct, all transparently flimsy excuses to see Penelope. No one was fooled, least of all Mrs. Perez, who took to packing elaborate picnic lunches for these trips, with knowing looks that made Miles blush like a schoolboy. As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, their courtship deepened. They exchanged letters on the days they couldn't see each other. Miles's practical, and sometimes amusingly blunt, Penelope's more eloquent but no less heartfelt. They shared their hopes, their fears, their dreams for the future. And with each meeting, each letter, each shared sunset, the bond between them grew stronger. By the time the first snow dusted the mountains, Penelope had become a beloved fixture in New Summit. Her students were making remarkable progress, and the town matrons had taken her under their collective wing, inviting her to quilting bees and Sunday suppers. Yet for all the warmth of her welcome, she found herself looking forward most to Miles's visits, to the way his face lit up when he saw her, to the quiet moments they shared away from curious eyes. It was on a crisp December evening, with Christmas just weeks away, that Miles arrived unexpectedly at her cottage. Penelope opened the door to find him standing there, hat in hand, an uncharacteristically nervous expression on his face. "Miles, I wasn't expecting you until Saturday," she exclaimed, delighted despite her surprise. "I couldn't wait," he said simply, stepping inside when she gestured him in. "I have something to ask you, and it wouldn't keep." Penelope's heart began to race as she took his coat and hat. "Is everything all right at the ranch?" "Everything's fine," he assured her. "Better than fine." He took her hands in his expression growing serious. "Penelope, these past months have been the happiest of my life." "Mine too," she said softly. "I know we agreed to court properly, to take our time," Miles continued. "But the truth is, I knew what I wanted, who I wanted, from the moment I pulled you from that river. Maybe even before, when I saw you fighting so bravely against the current." Penelope's breath caught as Miles reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "My mother's ring," he explained, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant gold band set with a single pearl. "My father gave it to her when they started their life together, and now," he dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. "Penelope Gilbert, would you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy sprang to Penelope's eyes. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Miles Caldwell, I will marry you." Miles slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise of their future together. They were married on New Year's Day, 1879, in the small church in New Summit. The entire town turned out for the celebration, along with the cowboys from Caldwell Ranch and Mrs. Perez, who wept openly throughout the ceremony. Penelope wore a simple white dress made by the town seamstress, and Miles looked uncommonly handsome in a new suit purchased specifically for the occasion. "I still can't believe you're my wife," Miles whispered as they shared their first dance as husband and wife at the reception held in the town hall. "Believe it," Penelope said, her eyes shining with happiness. "For better or worse, you're stuck with the woman you fished out of the river." "Best catch I ever made," Miles declared, spinning her around to the delight of the onlookers. They settled into life at the ranch, with Penelope continuing to teach in New Summit until the end of the school year. The daily separation was difficult, but it made their evenings and weekends together all the sweeter. Miles would often ride to town to escort her home, unwilling to let her make the journey alone. As spring breathed new life into the Nevada landscape, Penelope found herself with news that would change their lives forever. She waited until they were alone one evening, sitting on their favorite porch swing as the sun set behind the distant mountains. "Miles," she said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach, "we're going to have a baby." The look of wonder and joy that transformed Miles's face was something Penelope knew she would remember all her days. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." Penelope nodded, laughing as Miles swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her half-hearted protests. "Careful," she admonished, though she was laughing too. "I'm in a delicate condition, remember." Miles immediately set her down, his expression comically contrite. "Of course, I'm sorry." He placed his hand reverently on her stomach again. How long have you known?" "The doctor says January," Penelope told him, "and I've suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I told you." "January," Miles repeated, a slow smile spreading across his face. "A new year, a new life. Our family, Penelope." "Our family," she echoed, leaning into his embrace as the last rays of sunlight gilded the valley below them. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Miles threw himself into building a nursery, enlisting the help of his ranch hands, who teased him good-naturedly about his newfound carpentry skills. Penelope, meanwhile, sewed tiny garments and read every book on childcare she could find, determined to be prepared. Mrs. Perez hovered protectively, ensuring Penelope ate well and rested sufficiently. "My mother was a midwife in Mexico," she told Penelope one afternoon as they shelled peas on the porch. "I assisted at many births. Your baby will come into this world strong and healthy." "I hope so," Penelope said, resting a hand on her growing belly. "Sometimes I worry this is so far from a city, from doctors and hospitals." Mrs. Perez patted her hand reassuringly. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Nina. Your body knows what to do." "And besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "Miles would carry you to San Francisco on his back if you needed a doctor." Penelope laughed, knowing it was true. Her husband's protectiveness had only increased with her pregnancy, to the point where she sometimes had to remind him that she wasn't made of porcelain. As her due date approached, winter settled over Nevada, bringing snow and bitter cold. Miles insisted on having the town doctor stay at the ranch for the week surrounding Penelope's expected delivery, an arrangement that cost him a small fortune but brought him peace of mind. The baby, however, had plans of its own. 2 weeks before the doctor was due to arrive, Penelope woke in the middle of the night with sharp pains that left no doubt her time had come. "Miles," she whispered, shaking her sleeping husband. "The baby's coming." Miles was instantly alert, his face pale in the moonlight. "Now, are you sure?" Another contraction answered his question, making Penelope gasp. Miles was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his clothes. "I'll send Hank for the doctor," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "and wake Mrs. Perez." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and determination for Penelope. Mrs. Perez took charge of the birthing room, her calm efficiency a balm to both Penelope's fears and Miles's barely contained panic. The doctor arrived just as dawn was breaking, by which time Penelope's labor was well advanced. "You're doing beautifully, Mrs. Caldwell," the doctor assured her after his examination. "The baby is in position and everything looks normal." Miles, who had refused to leave Penelope's side despite Mrs. Perez's insistence that men had no place in the birthing room, held her hand through each contraction, murmuring encouragement and love. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her as she fought through a particularly difficult contraction. "You can do this. We can do this." As the winter sun climbed higher in the sky, Penelope's labor intensified. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, but she drew strength from Miles's unwavering presence and Mrs. Perez's quiet confidence. Finally, with a last tremendous effort, Penelope brought their child into the world. The baby's first cry filled the room, strong and indignant, the most beautiful sound Penelope had ever heard. "A boy," the doctor announced, placing the squalling infant on Penelope's chest. "A fine, healthy son." Miles stared at his wife and newborn son with wonder, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Penelope," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Look what we did." Penelope laughed through her own tears, cradling the tiny, perfect being against her heart. "Hello, little one," she said softly. "We've been waiting for you." After the doctor had examined both mother and child, pronouncing them healthy, and Mrs. Perez had helped clean up, Miles and Penelope were left alone with their son. The baby had settled after his first feeding, his tiny hand wrapped around Penelope's finger as he slept. "What shall we call him?" Miles asked, perched on the edge of the bed, unable to take his eyes off his son's face. "I was thinking William," Penelope suggested. "After my father." "William Miles Caldwell." Miles nodded, testing the name. "William, I like it." He reached out to stroke the baby's downy head. "Welcome to the world, William Miles Caldwell. You've got the best mother a boy could ask for." "And the best father," Penelope added, her heart so full of love she thought it might burst. Miles leaned in to kiss her, gentle and reverent. "Thank you," he said simply. "For him, for everything." Spring came to Nevada with a profusion of wildflowers and the sweet scent of renewal. Will thrived, growing stronger each day, his curious eyes taking in the world around him. He had Miles's blue eyes and something of Penelope's determined chin, a perfect blend of his parents. Penelope had decided not to return to teaching, at least for the time being. The school board in New Summit had expressed hope that she might reconsider when Will was older. But for now, her focus was on her family and the ranch that had become her home. One warm May afternoon, while we'll napped under Mrs. Perez's watchful eye, Miles took Penelope on a ride to their special place on the mesa. They spread a blanket among the wildflowers and shared a simple picnic, talking and laughing as they had during their courtship. "Are you happy, Penelope?" Miles asked suddenly, his expression serious. "This life, it's so different from what you knew in Boston." Penelope considered the question, looking out over the valley that had become as dear to her as the man beside her. "I am," she said with complete conviction. "Happier than I ever imagined possible, even with all you've lost." "The Ferry, your possessions, I found something far more valuable," Penelope interrupted, taking his hand. "A home, a family, love." She smiled at him, her heart in her eyes. "I think perhaps I had to lose everything to be ready to find you." Miles drew her into his arms, his kiss tender and passionate at once. "I thank God every day for bringing you to me," he said when they parted. "Even if it took a river trying to carry you away first." Penelope laughed, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Who would have thought," she mused, "that nearly drowning would turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to me?" "I'm just glad I was there to pull you out," Miles said, his arms tightening around her. "So am I," Penelope agreed softly. "So am I." They stayed on the mesa until the sun began to set, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that had first captured Penelope's heart, much as the man beside her had. As they rode back to the ranch, to their son, to the life they were building together, Penelope felt a profound sense of gratitude for the storm that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead given her everything she'd never known she wanted. In the years that followed, the Caldwell Ranch prospered under Miles's careful stewardship. Will grew into a strong, intelligent boy with his father's love for the land and his mother's thirst for knowledge. He was joined by a sister, Emma, when he was 3, and later by another brother, Thomas. Penelope eventually returned to teaching, but on her own terms, establishing a small school on the ranch for her children and those of the ranch hands. Her reputation as an educator spread, and soon children from neighboring ranches were riding Miles to attend her classes. Miles and Penelope's love deepened with each passing year, strengthened by the trials they faced together: droughts that threatened the cattle, a fire that destroyed part of the barn, the normal challenges of raising 3 spirited children. Through it all, they remained each other's steadfast support, their bond unbreakable. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Miles surprised Penelope with a trip to San Francisco, her first visit to the city she'd heard so much about but never seen. They spent a week exploring, attending the theater, dining in fine restaurants, and simply enjoying each other's company away from the responsibilities of the ranch. On their last night in the city, they stood on the balcony of their hotel room, watching the lights of the harbor. Miles wrapped his arms around Penelope from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Was it worth it?" he asked softly. "Leaving Boston all those years ago, taking a chance on a new life in the West?" Penelope turned in his arms, seeing in his face the same handsome features that had first greeted her when she'd been pulled from the river, now lined with the passage of time and countless days in the sun. His hair was touched with silver at the temples, but his blue eyes were as bright and loving as ever. "More than worth it," she assured him, reaching up to trace the beloved contours of his face. "I found everything I never knew I was looking for. A home, a purpose." She smiled, her heart as full as it had been on that long-ago day when he'd first kissed her on the mesa. A cowboy who wasn't afraid to swim into a raging river for a stranger. Miles laughed, the sound as dear to her now as it had been then. "Best decision I ever made," he declared, pulling her close. "Jumping into that river, finding you. Finding each other." Penelope corrected gently, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as the lights of San Francisco twinkled below and the stars shone above, bearing witness to a love born in the fury of a storm and tempered by the passage of time into something enduring and unbreakable. Years later, when their children were grown with families of their own, Miles and Penelope would still sometimes ride to their special place on the mesa, spreading a blanket among the wildflowers just as they had in their youth. They would sit together, hand in hand, watching the sun set over the land they both loved, the land that had brought them together against all odds. And Penelope would think about the strange and wonderful paths that life sometimes takes, how a terrible storm and a sinking ferry had led her not to death, but to the fullest, richest life she could have imagined. How a cowboy's strong arms had pulled her not just from a river, but into a future brighter than any she could have dreamed. "What are you thinking about?" Miles would ask, seeing the contemplative look on her face, and Penelope would smile, squeezing his hand. "About how sometimes what seems like the end of everything is really just the beginning." Miles would nod, understanding perfectly as he always did. "The beginning of us," he would say, and kiss her as tenderly as he had on their wedding day all those years ago. And in that moment, with the Nevada sky ablaze with color, and the man she loved by her side, Penelope would know with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, had always been meant to be, from the moment a ferry began to sink in a storm, and a cowboy swam out to pull her to shore.